before I started my PhD,
Yes.
I did this whole 10-month stint in India,
Yeah.
and I was doing grassroots kind of activism and things there.
Yeah.
So this little brochure is a remain of that era.
Oh, right.
I just found it the other day. I discovered it the other day in my pile of things.
Yeah.
And I just thought I'd show you because now that I look back at it, I mean, I haven't looked at this for a long time, you know, probably 10 or 7 years at least.
7 years?
Haven't looked at it, haven't looked at it for 7 years.
Wow.
But it just now that I do look back at it, it's like, oh my god, like the work that I'm doing now in my PhD. Yeah. But it just happened, like it wasn't deliberate.
That's what happens sometimes when you have something that has a high level of influence on your thinking. It shifts your worldview. And, when that happens, then you have a kind of, it could be almost a paradigm shift. And I'm not sure if that happened with you in this context, but hello. There's ghosts everywhere, because there was no one in my room opposite me. And that happens a lot.
The reason I thought that
that
one would be booked but not used is it was booked by a student group.
Yeah. Oh, student groups. Oh, yeah, that's what those meeting rooms.
I think at their business school clubs,
Yeah.
as part of the benefits of being a business school club is
Okay.
I think it was maybe the consulting club or something.
Right, so they do. Yeah. I don't know the rules on that stuff.
This looks high tech.
Yeah.
Actually, I might just sit around to the side.
Yeah, so you're not looking at it.
I'm thinking that I can see the phone really well.
Yeah.
Sorry about that.
Yeah,
I couldn't find any other place for it to go.
Sometimes it's good to record yourself and then,
So you're going to record your presentation?
Well, this is obviously to record what I'm presenting to you in 15 minutes today, and to record your voice for your feedback.
Yep.
And so that I can study it over the next couple of days.
Yep.
And then my next bit of submission will be on the 4th of September, and that's the final really for the panel.
Yep.
So if we can have one round of presentations before then, maybe Monday next week or something, I'll be really grateful. I mean, it could be with just Rachel.
We'll be in Scotland.
We'll
so.
be in Scotland.
Oh, you'll be in Scotland.
Yeah, in Barrow or in Glasgow.
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 Oh, nice.
International Social Innovation Research Conference.
So, Varun, I need to duck away at 11:30 or 11:35. So, sorry about
That's okay.
that tight timing, but thank you.
That's all right.
It was good that we could all get together.
Yeah, I think so, yeah.
So what probably is most useful is we say anything, just do your presentation.
I think so. And I'm gonna play a very low key because you guys need to. I've been working with them. You need to hear your feedback so that we're on the same page.
Yeah.
So,
Do you want to shut the door?
And we'll time it as well.
Yeah, well, thank you. That would be really good. I tend to go off on tangents, so I need to be kept. And that's why this is going to help me as well, because I can see the time in the phone
perfect.
as well.
Cool. Take it away.
Hello everyone, thank you for coming to my presentation. The topic of my presentation and my PhD is Sacred Cows and Clean Milk in the Anthropocene, Comparative Case Studies of Distributed Innovation and Ecosystem Resilience. Today I will be taking you through the practical problem, the research problem, going through the scope and context and the theoretical and methodological framework of my study. Beginning with the practical problem, at the moment, around the world, there are 570 million farms, all contributing to the food security and the sustainability of the food system has recently come into question. Some of the farmers are moving towards clean animal products, so to speak, so they're trying to minimize the ecological footprint of their operations, of their activities. Scientists, organizations, and consumers are working together in this pursuit. The story of dairying in particular has been dubbed as the long shadow of livestock, and this is by a 2006 United Nations report. How my PhD aims contribute to this practical problem is by, instead of calling it livestock's long shadow, which is rather a kind of putting the blame on, you know, one sector, so to speak, view, we would like to, through my research, I would like to explore ways of reconceptualizing, you know, ways of doing things that are more sustainable, involving both mainstreams and grassroots actors. So dairy farmers want to be more sustainable. They realize the importance of building resilience. However, it is normally expected that resource constraints acting on dairy farmers will limit their ability to contribute to ecosystem resilience. And this is exactly where comparing India and New Zealand, the dairying systems within these two locations, really offers to contribute to the situation, because there are configurations between resources and resilience across social and institutional boundaries. By understanding these configurations, we can have a better understanding of how distributed innovation contributes to ecosystem resilience. From this practical problem, the research problem that emerges for me is why and how do innovators contribute to ecosystem resilience? And in particular, how do they overcome their resource dependencies to make this contribution? We can divide this research question into 3 sub-questions. Research question 1 for me is, why do innovators relinquish control over the innovation process, as is implied by the phenomena of distributed innovation? And who do they relinquish control to, and at what stages in the innovation process do they relinquish this control? So this is the first sub-question that emerges from the research question I'm trying to tackle through my PhD. The second research question is, how do innovators frame their contribution to the environment? The third research question is, how does the strategic context in which they operate influence the kinds of stories that they tell, and vice versa? The framework of theory and literature that I'll be sharing with you today consists of process ontology and epistemology, actor network theory, resource dependence theory, socio-ecological systems, distributed innovation, and grassroots innovations for sustainability. Although it seems like a long list, they are very synergistic, as I will be explaining to you today. First of all, process ontology and epistemology. In the literature, there are 4 general ways of looking at process theories. These are teleology, which looks at the goals of innovators; dialectics, which looks at conflicts between, for example, mainstreams actors and grassroots actors; evolutionary approaches, which look at kind of multiple systems changing over long periods of time; and life cycle approaches, which look at the, for example, diffusion of an innovation. All of these 4 approaches are very important when we consider movements such as the clean animal product movement. Actor network theory really helps us to understand how and where to land for innovators when they're looking at these global and local situations, when they're looking at solutions that might be seen as being out of this world, things like genetically modified yeast, or things like going into Mars, and when they're comparing these solutions with solutions which are very kind of earth-bound solutions, things like earth ships, things like organic farming. So actor network theory really offers us this lens of kind of bringing symmetry to these diverse approaches. And in particular, it helps us to understand the internalization of externalities. How might innovators approach the internalization of externalities, which is, in other words, the process through which we can bring things into our calculation as innovators that were previously excluded from our calculations. Resource dependence theory is a theoretical lens which is very well suited to looking at how social actors can gain control over focal organizations such as corporations and large cooperatives, which are a part of the dairying system both in India and New Zealand. One example that comes to mind is the giving of rights to rivers, which has happened both in New Zealand and in India recently. And according to resource dependence theory, we can find an explanation of why did this not happen over the last 172 years that the battle has been fought. Why now? And one of the answers that we can glean from this particular theoretical perspective is that the visibility of the behavior in question has now come to the foray with technologies such as drones that make the behavior of dairy farmers visible, particularly when it comes to dumping toxic materials into the river. So with the visibility increasing, the social actors may be able to gain more control over the focal organizations in question. Socio-ecological systems theory helps us to understand why innovators and their strategies, how these strategies change over time. In particular, there's 5 concepts that socio-ecological systems theory really helps us to understand that relate to this particular dairying system in both India and New Zealand. These are adaptive cycles, panarchy, resilience, adaptability, and transformation. Without going into too much depth, what I can say is the concept of resilience is really the cornerstone of my research, because it differentiates between positive resilience and negative resilience, where positive resilience is seen as a broad recovery of relationships after a disturbance, which includes social and ecological elements. Negative resilience relates to the recovery of narrowly focused economic outcomes after a disturbance. And this is why I've chosen to focus on the idea of resilience, which comes from socio-ecological systems theory. How does this relate to innovation? The distributed innovation literature tells us that there are 2 different ways in the literature of looking at how companies involve others in the process of innovation. Free innovation or consumer innovation on the one hand, and open innovation on the other. The concept of open innovation views the process much like a funnel with holes in it, and so there's opportunities for cross-pollination to occur throughout the process, including ideas and paths to market. The process of free innovation or consumer innovation is this idea that consumers can actually contribute to the R&D of a producer innovation paradigm, and they can be further supported by that R&D function of the organization in their pursuit of coming up with novel ideas for products. How this has been studied in the literature to date, things like skateboards, surgical equipment have been studied, but a limited attention has been given to things that particularly are contributing to positive resilience. Things such as yeast-derived milk, which is a process that was developed by a user of dairy products who felt guilty about using dairy because of the impacts of dairying on the environment. And so this is the area, this specific area in which my research will aim to contribute. How does grassroots innovation for sustainability fit into my theoretical framework? These are networks of activists and organizations generating bottom-up solutions for sustainable development. And the unique thing about grassroots innovations for sustainability is that they focus on solving societal problems, whereas distributed innovation doesn't necessarily focus on solving societal problems, as we mentioned earlier. These are created through values, through culture. They're normally owned by communities as opposed to individuals, and they take place at multiple levels, including individual, group, and societal levels, which are all the underpinning kind of framework for my PhD. So here we have a visual representation of my theoretical contribution, positioned at the intersection of these overarching theoretical perspectives and at the intersection of these literature domains, these domains of literature including distributed innovation, process ontology, and grassroots innovations for sustainability. This is a very high-level way of visualizing my theoretical framework, and I will draw on this further in the last slide today. I've got approximately 4 minutes to go, so I'll carry on moving. These are some of my propositions that are very tentative at this stage, but they help us to understand what I will be looking for when I'm out in the field collecting data. And I'll be just summarizing them very generally here. The idea with the first research question is that there is a relationship between relinquishing control and distributed innovation. When we relinquish control, we find that we're moving towards a distributed innovation ecosystem. And this is, at a kind of a micro level of action, that might be taken on an individual level. And then if we kind of move up a level, there's a relationship between establishing feedback loops at an organizational level. Establishing feedback loops leads to positive resilience and vice versa. And now if we move a little bit broader at the community or societal level, so going up one more level, the research question 3 is saying that there's a relationship between the types of stories a society or a group or a community tells about the environment and the types of strategies that they come up with in relation to the environment. The scope of this study is dairying regions, and I'm positioning these regions as socio-ecological systems, particularly Taranaki in New Zealand and Haryana, which is a place that I'm familiar with, in India, which are both very famous dairying regions in both these locations. My methodology consists of participative narrative inquiry, comparative case studies. I'll be sampling my dairying systems purposefully, and I'll be using short-term ethnography as my research method, which I'll explain further. Participative narrative inquiry consists of telling stories or analyzing how stories are told in a real-life interaction context. Why is a particular story told when it is told, and why is it sequenced the way that it is in relation to other stories that are told in conversation. So this is a real strength of participative narrative inquiry, is that it looks at the way that stories are told in interaction, in the flow of daily life. Comparative case studies as a research strategy, for me, the configuration of resources and resilience is what really constitutes a case. In some cases, I might think in the beginning that this is a case of distributed innovation, and later on realize that it's actually a case of something else. So it's a configuration or characteristics, but transformation in cases means that there's really very little control in my hands as the researcher as to how a particular case unfolds. I'm interested in appearance, disappearance, combination, and transformation, which I'll explain in my final slide. I've got about 2 minutes, so I'll try to be brief. The purpose of sampling, I'll be going to multiple sites, and as I find more information about particular dairying systems, there might be more kind of relevance in one as opposed to another site, so things will be evolving as it unfolds. Short-term ethnography as research method, I'll be focusing on a form of intensity, empathy, and ongoing dialogue between theory and data.
Wow, that's loud. That was 15 minutes.
So I'll finish up here. Theory method fit, I'll be looking at interviews, observations, documents, so I'll be collecting data from a variety of, using a variety of forms, and my plan will be that I'll begin with interviews and documents, and then I'll have a kind of a staged access design, so gaining access in stages as opposed to trying to have a blanket approach to gaining access. And finally, I want to end on this slide is my unique theoretical and practical contribution will be this framework of process ontology, epistemology on the one hand, grassroots innovation and distributed innovation on the other hand, and obviously this focus on socio-ecological systems and resource dependencies. So I'll be aiming to come up with an integrative framework that contributes to both theory and practice.
There's definitely 15 minutes Not 20?
Well, that's what I think we should just nail to see whether you do have 20 minutes. I can't remember.
Yep.
Even though I've been on a fair few panels,
It's
whether it's
usually-
15 or 20.
Yeah.
But there's quite a few presenting at the same time.
Have you had any?
I think it is 20.
Have you
Okay.
had,
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
if you practice for 15
Yes.
and give yourself relax into your presentation, and
Yeah, because I think he probably would have been about bang on 20.
yeah,
If you-
so
if you-
breathe.
Yeah.
Give yourself time to breathe.
So
But
you're
yeah.
in decent shape time-wise, I think.
Yeah. All right.
Yeah.
Thanks, Varun. Jeremy, do you want to kick off?
Well, I like, when I sit there and listen to that, I feel like you've done a heap of work. That's the first impression, is that you've done a heap of work, and you understand a whole lot. So well done on that. So
Thank you.
there's a general kind of impression is like, shit, he knows this stuff. And this seems like a, you know, I'm happy to swear on video. So cool, well done. So I felt like this guy should be a PhD student. He should get through his provisional kind of year. Unfortunately, that's not the criteria for getting through, right? So there, where do we start? Let's start with the elephant in the room for me, which is the comparative bit. There's other stuff which I think we can talk about the way they present the theories and that kind of thing. But the big one is and this is the thing that I think will get picked up on most from your panel, is why compare India and New Zealand versus not comparing, or doing any other kind of context, or comparing iwi-owned dairy enterprise in New Zealand versus a non-iwi. No, so there needs to be a good logic as to why India and New Zealand, and then a little bit more of the, you know, what is it about India? And it's not just because it's India and it's a developing country and it's large, and New Zealand's developed and it's small. There's lots of examples of that. There's something about those contexts which needs to be theoretically interesting, not just contextually kind of interesting. So some rationale behind that, and a good answer is not because you've got access and that you're Indian and you can access an Indian kind of context, and you're a Kiwi and you can access a Kiwi context. That's a little bit too, that's convenient, but it's not a good rationale. So what is that? Why? So yeah, so put that as a question.
Do you want me to answer it? Okay. The
Answer
idea
is with
is-
the panel, yeah.
'cause, I mean, I don't know how good the answer will be at the moment, but yes, I see that, and I know that I'm struggling with that myself, theoretically finding out why is it theoretically relevant.
Yeah.
So the feeling is that India is doing things on the grassroots because there are kind of these loose resource interdependencies that allow farmers to say, well, I'm going to plug out of this system and I'm going to plug into that one, and it's not so much of a big deal in India. So it's kind of easy for a farmer to say, I'm going to start kind of sending my manure to this place, you know, because of these kinds of different resource and resilience configurations. And also, they've had this history of, before independence, doing things in that kind of local, you know, ecological way, which after independence now, obviously there's this other organized sector now, this mainstream movement where everything is done through machines, and, you know, it's kind of very high tech, but not necessarily good for the environment. So India has these both of these systems kind of operating side by side. And in New Zealand, I think when I talk to you know, people that are in dairying in New Zealand, they're kind of very entrenched. There's not two different ways of doing dairying here. You kind of either you kind of buy into that whole package, that's the way it's done, or you just don't do dairying. You do something else. So I think when we look at these configurations of resources or resource dependencies and resilience, I think India has something maybe to offer to New Zealand. However, on the other hand, New Zealand has something to offer to India in terms of how do you make it worthwhile? Because New Zealand gets 100 times more money for its milk on the global market than India does. So I think both cases have something to learn from each other. If it doesn't pay me, then being ecologically resilient doesn't I can't do it, but it doesn't pay me now.
Okay, so I'll be really
Yes.
practical, Varun, in this, and I think, given the time frame,
Yes.
I'd be firstly saying I would not start with your opening line, which this is a comparative study. I think what you need to do is build out to your research questions that are, by definition, curious about two different things that then lend itself to doing some kind of a comparative. That's a not very subtle shift in your framing, but you don't start by saying I'm going to do a comparative study. You start by saying I'm curious about understanding what are the implications for looking at dairying in a context where over time it's been established and entrenched to one particular way, and comparing that with a context whereby there are multiple perspectives. We could then be sitting there going, oh, that's interesting, I think it might be curious to compare Ireland and China. And you go, however, I'm going to compare New Zealand and India. So you don't start by saying it's a comparative between New Zealand and India. You start by saying, this is the phenomena of interest to me. These are my research questions. And then when you lead the audience through your written proposal and your verbal proposal to how are you then going to answer those questions, that's when you talk about, so I'm going to compare two different contexts, because that's going to enable me to. Because if you start with that first, the audience is sitting there going, all the way through that presentation, well, what's comparative about India and New Zealand? That doesn't make sense. Does that make sense?
Oh, absolutely.
And so that's a really practical, just cut through. So I think
because you don't want people to think that you're making your research questions and your theory fit the places that you want to do the research.
exactly. And this isn't about India and New Zealand, right? We've had this conversation. This is about saying,
Yes.
in one context, this is how it's emerged and how they're handling it. What are the implications of that? Because at the end of it, I might want to come along and say, I'm going to replicate this guy's work, but I'm going to compare two other countries that do, dairying. That's got nothing to do with. So one might be small and established and institutionally confined, and one might be diverse and distributed and emerging. It's not India and New Zealand. No one's interested in those two countries. They're interested in what is it that you are curious about comparing, and why is that context useful. So I'd be just really blunt about that through both your written proposal and your
You almost certainly still get the questions on it, and I think your answer's pretty good, except related, as you started to relate it back to the theory, which will naturally be more apparent in the sequencing that Deb talked about. What is it about those contexts which is going to help you answer these questions which are about the theory?
Yeah, and make sure in your answers, and I've challenged you on this before, Varun, to be really clear that this is not research that you think you have the answer for and you're looking for the question, but that you are just curious. So what is it about these that are you deeply curious about, rather than thinking this is what's already happening and I know that, and this is already what's happening, and I think the two can learn from each other, because that's a consultant's response. That's like me advising government that there's some stuff happening in Israel, and I think the government needs to know it, right? So be very careful in your framing around both your contribution and the extent to which this research is going to make a difference. They might learn from one another, but in all reality, no one may ever read your PhD, and you'll be examined academically. Okay, so it's great to have ambition that it does have an impact, and I think we should all have that in our research. But for this particular part of the process, I'll be very clear about making an academic contribution, rather than that India can learn from New Zealand and New Zealand can learn from India. And it kind of pains me to say it as someone who spends her life doing practical things, but I think.
Well, bear in mind that your three supervisors are exactly like you, driven to do academic stuff to solve practical problems. But no one else that ever looks at your work may think in that way, like your panel.
Oh, absolutely. I think it's brilliant advice. And I'm surprised there's no grassroots innovation dairy in New Zealand. In New Zealand. I would
Well,
have thought.
you
I
know,
mean, I know
America?
historically we had plenty.
You got the
But
likes
I-
of Glenn Harud with the.
But it's kind of like questions the whole evolution of dairy industry in New
Well,
Zealand.
and again, if you make that kind of
Yeah.
sweeping
Yeah,
statement,
that's what I would be by. If I was in
Yes,
the,
yes,
you know,
of
if I was
course.
like,
I'd sit
what?
there
Are
going,
you
I
sure?
know
I
what
could
it
just
is."
say 5 grassroots
Yeah.
innovation dairy movements
Yeah.
in New Zealand, and then that would be it. They'd be like, actually, you know, you don't
You're on
need to-
shaky
and then
ground.
You can do a comparative.
So I would, yes, stand
Yeah,
clear of
yeah.
that, say that
Mm.
majority of
Mm.
dairy
Yes.
adheres to a particular system,
Yes.
or, you know, over time there's been more adherence to a system.
Yeah, it's definitely been
Driven
an
by the
evolutionary
frontiers or whatever.
process which has created a
But
kind of sector which is
But I'm with
driven by,
Rachel.
yeah.
Don't say there isn't any, because
Yeah.
those sweeping statements will,
Well, actually, now that you mention that, there is the Happy Cow Company,
Mhm.
and
Yeah.
Miraka is doing some very
That's
grassroots
right.
things as
Yeah,
well. So
right.
you're right, absolutely. I shouldn't.
just
yeah.
any
Yeah.
generalisation.
So, and you could just say that, yes, you're
Yeah.
aware of Miraka and Happy Cow, you know,
Yeah.
but, you know, generally the industry's evolved differently. I don't know.
Yeah.
And we've got the state sponsored
Yeah.
monopoly.
I mean, at the end of the day, we can advise you on a lot of things, but,
Yes.
you know, we can take you so far,
Mm.
and then really it's up to our colleagues in the panel that will take it to the next level, you know, as well. So you're kind of lucky you have this staged process, but we need to get you in shape so that is a credible case moving forward.
So I'll just pick up, and again, I'm with Jamie,
Yeah.
that well done. It is really evident that you have traversed a great deal of literature and thinking and all of that stuff. Now I'll just cut through to the some feedback. You start your presentation and talk about ecosystem resilience. You then drop that phrase and talk about positive resilience, and so I think you need to be really clear. They're not interchangeable. If you're talking about ecosystem resilience, what does that mean? And it may be linked to your notion of positive resilience, but you frame your the very first slide talks about, I think it's just got resilience, and you put in the word ecosystem. So again, they're just little things that people will pick up on. Are you studying ecosystem resilience? Oh, that's curious. What does it mean? Oh, hang on, he's not talking about that anymore. He's talking about something else. So again, just something potentially, it's small, but potentially could be impactful. Again, can I, and I don't in any way, Varun, want these comments to downplay the importance of the research and your motivation for doing it. But again, when you made your early statements around your contribution, I was just thinking, they sound really lofty, and I would be just languaging it around making a contribution to our understanding of this and advancing the thinking in this area rather than kind of solving the problem of, you know, you talked about the long shadow of livestock and how that's a negative thing and you want to turn that around. You're making a contribution to how that might be turned around rather than doing it yourself. Then if I go to your research questions, your first one worries me because it starts, do you want to pull those up? It starts with a why question, and I just think you have to be a little bit careful with research questions that start with why. Yeah. Because what's implicit in there is firstly that innovators do relinquish control and that they do so at various stages and to others. So implicit in that is 3 assumptions, as opposed to a curiosity about to what extent might they relinquish control, why questions assume something's happening in your job then is to understand it, which takes away the curiosity. I'm going to explain that very well. Okay.
No, I think it's good. Keep talking.
So I would steer clear of a why research question. You may actually be implicitly curious about why people do what they do, but it's not as specific as that. So why has the dairy industry emerged the way it has is just sort of a general why question. But when you go to yours, can you see where I'm picking up the implicit assumptions?
Yeah.
So why do innovators relinquish control? Assumption that they do. Over innovation process, they assume that they're doing it towards the innovation as opposed to some other reason, and that it happens at different stages, and that they do it towards someone else. So it's just layered in that statement. The other two, on the other hand, are much more easily understood because how do they? Your answer might be, well, they don't really, and that's okay, right? Whereas you'll, so
Could I say, instead of why, how do they relinquish control? Now, there is an assumption there.
Yeah.
Now, the assumption is supported by this literature on relinquishment.
Yeah.
So, could I then say, how do they, and then use that as a contribution to that literature?
Yeah.
Or just take out the why.
Yeah.
Just to ask.
Or do they?
That's right.
Take
Because
out
then
the
it
why.
becomes an actual
Oh,
question.
great. Yeah, then it's a yes or no.
Just take
Well,
out the
and you
why.
don't want yes or no, so it might be to what extent.
Yeah.
Or,
Sure.
you know what I mean?
Yeah.
What you're trying to
Do it
understand
arrangement
is that it's
with
probably more, it's nuanced, and some do and some don't, and sometimes and not at other times, right? So you want to just leave in there the opportunity for the nuance and the messiness, but yeah.
But still give it some kind of a structure to, to understand, or a framework to put around the whole PhD.
And research questions are just jolly hard to write, let's be frank. So
Yeah, the reason why the wording of your research questions is going to be particularly important for your PhD proposal. They're important generally, and they're hard to write and that kind of thing. But because you have got propositions and arrows and that kind of thing in subsequent slides, people then expect you to be precise because you've gone, you start to unpack this stuff in quite precise ways. So if you've got general kind of stuff later on in the proposal and in the presentation, then these can be a little bit more broad. But if you're going to be really specific and say this leads to this, even if that's not what you're saying, it looks like it because there's arrows, then people are going to go, well, that means this better be really bulletproof and no layered assumptions and that kind of thing. So just be conscious of humans being humans when they're looking at stuff. Are your research questions in your mind nested in the sense that
Yes.
2 and 3 sit within 1 and 3 sits within 2?
Yes.
So that make sure that's clear, but it can mean that maybe if you're wrestling with trying to get research question 1 to have the words that's still about what you're curious about and that kind of, you can't do it, that maybe that you take research question 1 out as a research question and make it more of an overarching aim and that kind. I know you've got a research aim that's broad, but you know what I mean, and so that
Like a meta question.
yeah, and so that in answering 2 and 3, you're going to contribute to understanding of 1. But if you can, just take off the why or something and you end up with something that you're happy with.
To what extent do innovators relinquish control over the innovation
Or
process?
just do.
yeah.
do
Do
that.
whatever it is relinquish.
Yeah.
Just take
Or
out
how
the
do
why.
Yeah.
So just think
Yeah,
about
I'll think
that.
about that.
Yeah.
Thank you.
And then sort of just rocking on, I'm a bit caught here in how to give the most helpful feedback. So I think your theoretical backdrop is in depth and extensive. I worry that it's potentially too messy and too complex. So firstly, I would encourage you to get rid of the abbreviations and just put that all the way through those brackets. Drop that and just use the language in there, because when you see that up there, no one will remember what the theories are if they want to talk to it.
Okay.
So drop that, that's just a
Can I do
side
the next
comment.
slide? The other slide that you had? Oh, no. Yeah.
What concerns me is that embedded in each of those 6 theoretical frames, there's at least 4 or 5 variables or sub-themes or categories or other ways that the theories have been articulated. So if you go 6 by 5, there's 30 things that you have potentially raised as of interest. And when you think about your last one, you talk about under your social ecological systems theory, there's 5, and then you just decide, I like resilience.
Yes.
And then under something else, there's 4 or 5, and you think, oh, I'm quite like
The
that.
visibility, yeah.
And so you just, you're plucking, and
Yes.
it's not the kind of the purist would say that's kind of not how theory works. You can't just take a big theoretical frame and go, I'll look at that, and I'll look at that, and here's what I'm interested in. Of course, that's what we do in reality, but I would just be very hesitant in at this particular intersection of your PhD, do you want to present all 6? Are they really necessary, or is there 2 or 3 that deeply inform your proposal, and 2 or 3 that just add as a backdrop to your understanding, to your context, etc., and then you talk to those? Because I think trying to talk to 6 in 20 minutes and do justice and then pull together a theoretical frame is just opening yourself up. All you need is one person in the room who is deeply, deeply connected and embedded in that theory, or one other, and they'll go, wait a minute, I don't think you've really understood that fully. Right? And so you're exposing yourself to 6 theoretical frames. Now, I'm happy to be wrong and get advice from other people in terms of whether you think it's better to leave them all there.
I think it's sophisticated, and all the research that I'm following at the moment, and MB and cause, because I'm associated with several cause now, is transdisciplinary and interdisciplinary.
Yep.
So where the spaces are moving is very much in this particular space, which is really exciting to be in there. But I think at this particular stage, to get your PhD done and dusted and finished, so that you can move into a postdoc, I think the advice is really good. I think keep it tighten the theoretical framework, and then but you know, have a matrix of theories, but tighten it up, because if you do, then where you're contributing to is much clearer. So because you've got so many busy theories happening in that space, and you talk to them extremely well, and you obviously know them very well as well, that's great and good for postdoc, but for doctorate, just keep it tighter so that your contribution is clearer. That's what I would say, to a particular space and field.
And it doesn't mean not being multidisciplinary, by the way. So out of those 6, you know, we're not suggesting you take 1 and drop 5. I'm not convinced that, at least for your proposal stage, that you will be able to do justice to all 6. So what you might do is have a backdrop that says, this is what has been informing my thinking. And, you know, these are the 2 or 3 that have predominantly contributed to my research question and my articulation. Now, in all reality, Varun, when you come to writing out your final part, you may go, it wasn't those 2 that most helpfully explained the findings, it's these other 2. So you've got them there, you're not just missing any of them. But I'm just concerned that...
Well, can I respond to that? And I think that what you're saying makes a lot of sense to me, and even in my own mind, when I'm visualizing the PhD framework, it does help to have 2 or 3 as opposed to 5 or 6, and I totally get that. For example, socio-ecological systems theory talks about resilience thinking versus stability thinking. So that could take care of everything that I've kind of said about resource dependence theory could kind of fit into just socio-ecological systems theory, because one view, the resource dependence view, is kind of like this move towards stability thinking, whereas resilience, so that I can totally see that happening, and I can do that. It wouldn't take a long time to...
I think SES and distributive innovation are the core to me, you know, just what looking at.
And
those 2, so, you
right.
know, I mean, what SES and your work can contribute to distributive innovation is phenomenal. You know, because SES is such a huge, well-grounded body of research, and there's so much stuff that's happened in that space. I mean, Hollands is probably the most cited, you know, ecological scientist ever.
Yeah, and I think that's right, Rachel, because what I then go is, if you think about what you would write, and it's all really in your proposal, I think it's not a matter of taking it all out and ignoring it, it's just rejigging it. So there's a section on the kind of the ecological thinking, and that's informed, and and you can talk about it being an extension of resource dependence in terms of the way it frames up stability, and then it adds in this other one dimension here. So that kind of takes into account, doesn't dismiss resource dependence, but just the stability way of thinking is an extension of this line of inquiry, or this, you know. And it's the same if you drop back to your first theoretical frame, this one. You know, I look at that and go, are you sure that you want to talk to all four of those quadrants, or is that just a backdrop to the way of thinking about how we understand theoretical perspectives, i.e. are they prescriptive or constructive, individual, multiple? That's almost it's not theoretically informing your work, it's just saying, let's be aware when we're talking about understanding the research that we're doing, that we understand the level of analysis, individual, multiple.
Vanderbilt stuff's great.
And it is
There's
great,
a lot of good stuff.
but it doesn't have to be
Yeah,
a theory,
no,
right?
that's
It's
right.
just it's an informed,
Backdrop.
so you
Yeah.
can say, you know, drawing on Vanderbilt and Paul's
Yeah,
work,
yeah.
my research sits in this kind of quadrant. You don't have to do the
Yeah.
theory
Yeah,
of
yeah,
it,
yeah.
right? Because it doesn't specifically inform your.
And the other thing is too, the panel will have read your work, and so they'll have a fully informed document with all of the stuff in it. But the audience won't see your stuff. So you've got to think, you know, how do I make this informative and interesting and engaged for this audience? Who will the panel will have everything, but not the entire audience. But so I think you're almost there. You're getting really close. Maybe
Absolutely.
you know 75% there. Just tracking.
Yeah, can you go to your Venn diagram?
Yeah, that kind of answers that question anyway.
Well, it's kind of like you're prioritising. I feel like that prioritises three of them, right? And you're saying that the other three are subsumed within them. So it may.
Yeah, because distributed innovation comes from that stability mindset of how do we, use ideas, external ideas, to become more entrenched, to become more stable. Whereas grassroots innovations come from that socio-ecological systems view of how do we contribute to, socio-ecological issues, and process ontology like actor network theory and systems. They're kind of both, providing us this view of looking at the world not as an entity, but as something that's perpetually in motion. So, I mean, I totally see that they can be made more parsimonious.
So you're actually, if you drop below two and pick up on Rachel's point, perhaps what you're interested in is innovation and social-ecological systems, and then the different ways of thinking about innovation through grassroots or distributed, right? So it might be those two, and then the others get subsumed in there. I'm just less sure about the actor network theory and where that fits.
Too busy.
But I just
there's
think
so
it's
much in AMT and RDT that you're not going to talk about
you just
that
Yeah.
potentially distract from what you are, and then you're like, holy shit, those are big things.
Yeah.
And that's the cherry picking reservation that I've got, right? Because what you're doing is you're putting up a big theoretical,
Smorgasbord.
but then you're taking that.
And then taking
I'm taking the garnish off this dish.
Yeah, exactly.
And that.
That's
It
right.
is a little
So, which is
That's
what
what the
we
cynic
do,
would say.
and we do all do it, by the way. But I just get clear of doing it blatantly like that in a proposal.
Yeah.
And bear in mind that this is without data, right? So your data may say, actually, I'm going deep into RDT here, and SES is taking a back seat, and this is going to be research field
Could be.
theory.
That's right.
Could be.
But that's where you end up,
Yeah.
which is great, rather than
Yeah.
saying I'm going to start with the entire theoretical world on my in my arms and pick and choose. So that would be my overarching thing. So I'm just going to dip away. And then the same with your methodology. You go through the four. That one. Each of those four, and some of them. So the comparative case and the purposive sampling are kind of ways of doing short-term ethnography, right? So that doesn't work for me.
It's not linear either. So maybe a slightly different way of putting that. Into that.
So, because what I mean is, if you are thinking about doing short-term ethnographic research as your method, that then you start to say, what are you doing? Why are you doing that? What's going to inform that?
And your methodology is it's just qualitative, and that's your those are your
I'll get
methods.
you to pick that up.
Those are your methods. So you need to explain your methodology a bit better, and then your methods, which are really that. And there'll be some reason and justification for your methodology as well. You need to be able to justify that.
But I'm with you. I think that Varun, you are actually, despite all of this feedback, you are much closer.
Yeah, absolutely.
And it's reading, well, and your writing is very clear and easy to
Mm.
follow. It's just these kind of things not following.
Yeah, thank you, Claire.
Okay.
I'll definitely take that.
Enjoy
into
Glasgow.
account.
Oh,
Don't forget to pick up your tartan.
oh, we skirt.
We'll come back and matching skirts. Yeah.
I picked up 3 of my family tartans up there. I love it. Love Scotland. Have you got your
so,
tartan? There you go. Find out your tartan.
Okay.
Fantastic.
Can I respond to the
Colonial
methodological
Yeah.
slide?
Mm.
So what I'm seeing is I could, for this slide, have one kind of a visual and then just explain my qualitative, why am I going with the qualitative methodology as opposed to a quant or a mixed method, just have a few bullet points and maybe a diagram? Would that work better for this slide?
I quite like the clarity of the slide.
Yeah,
I do like that. The dead point is just think about
The linearity of it, yeah.
Yeah,
Just get rid of the arrows.
Well,
The arrows are kind of suggesting that.
I don't mind that. It's just maybe a different sequence. So the thing to keep in mind is it may not be that order. So if your methodology is ethnographic, then probably the case studies are the output rather than the earlier stage. So you are going to use short-term ethnography to generate case studies. You're not going to do case studies which lead to an ethnography. It's the other way around. So something like that, I do like the clarity of it. Just think about the sequencing, but also make sure this is connected to the either on the slide or with what you say, that this needs to make sense relative to the research questions and the theory, right?
Yeah.
So just make sure, because you're telling a story, and you know that, you're a design guy, right? So you understand humans and how the PhD proposal, the presentation is going to be stories, which is why you're starting with the practical problem and the long shadow and that kind of thing. And so just make sure that the narrative holds here, that because we've got this gap in what we know in the theory, we've got the spectre of this problem around screwing up the planet. One way we're doing it is the theory. Therefore, we need to know this stuff. And it's logical that I research in these places. It's logical that I do it in this way. And so that needs to come through the methodology.
So, for example, I didn't really say, as you pointed out just then, how does the ethnographic approach actually contribute to answering the question?
Yeah, so that was the bit that got rushed.
So
Yes.
the methodology, again, like I say, you've mixed up the methodology and method. So you've got a methodology. Your methodology is qualitative, and then you're going to have to just give a justification. So that's what you need to say in your methodology slide. What's the justification? How does this align with my study? You know, and then your methods. Again, justification. Why am I doing this? And how does this align with what I'm asking? So you've got this marvelous alignment going on, and so that's what the overall, clicking into place, make it easy for people to see why and justification.
So you may sacrifice the stuff here around the nuance of how ethnography works may need to get sacrificed so that what we're talking about becomes more clear, the logic of the why rather than the
Right.
so like if we get in, like particularly like us three would like to get into the nuances of how ethnographic data works and that kind of thing, but it's not really for the presentation.
No.
We'll do that over a glass of wine and in your methods chapter. And so that logic. So if you go forward, there's a staircase slide which I think this is really useful. So that's method. There's a whole bunch of really clear, that's a lovely slide around method. What's not on the slide that needs to come out of your mouth on the slide is the theory bit. So what's the connection? If that's the theory method fit, what's the theory? So just be conscious of that, that if you...
if you say something, they'll say, well, and you have to be able to answer. So maybe you would just take out the theory and just have methods that, I don't know.
Yeah,
and
if I play a really strong devil's advocate here, and I don't like limiting PhD students within this way, but it may just be useful for getting through September. Because remember, you have to assume, just walk into that room assuming that the people on that panel don't like you, don't care about you, and don't want your PhD to happen, right? So you've got to overcome all the barriers. It's not true. I think you kind of won the panel lottery in a sense, but just assume that, and then what are all the things that they could potentially get me on. One thing, if I looked at that, playing devil's advocate, is like, oh my god, there is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 methods that he's bundling under ethnographic. And ethnography is kind of a collection of data collection methods, but that may go, whoa. And so you may just want to, I don't know what you think, Rachel, this is, for the purpose of the presentation, is to cut off the last 3.
The only thing that I could think of is if under film it's where you're creating some digital archives, which is, useful. But is the ethics.
Yeah, and I think that's what I've tried to talk to in this slide.
Ethics, whether they'll let, whether you'll be able to, like I had photos and stuff, and it's a big thing to get through ethics, is the visual data. So it's visual ethnography, because there's a lot of visual ethnography going on here. And of course you can, but you just have to be clear with your participants.
Because bear in mind, you could do this PhD just with interviews. You could do this PhD with interviews and observation. Or like I did with mine, was interviews, observation and documents. So those are more than adequate. And so the more that you add, the more work it creates.
It does create a lot of work. I did all of that in my PhD, and it was tremendously hard work.
So just think about it.
Can I share something with you on this, which is, Sarah Pink is somebody who I've started following over the last couple of months.
Yes, visual ethnography.
Yeah, and I think you introduced me to her through that book
right.
that you introduced me to.
Yeah.
And so what she's done is, now I know that I've let these in, so I'd be more willing to let go of these, you see, than these. Because what she's done is she's kind of said that traditional observation doesn't really capture the kind of digital element and the kind of fast-paced element of today's life.
Okay, so what you're talking about, you're justifying both traditional ethnography and visual ethnography. You've actually got a combination of both of those going on, which is great. It's very robust from a qualitative perspective to have elements of both traditional and visual ethnography. Visual ethnography is a paradigm in and of itself. And I've got a book actually at home on digital research as well, which is cool. But so I think
just be conscious.
Just be clear and justifications again.
And be aware that that's going to seem really ambitious. So they'll just say, oh, and you have to pull that off and within a PhD.
True.
So if you leave it as is, just say, look, I know this is ambitious, but it makes sense.
Yes.
And this is why, this is
justify.
And with the ethical element, what I tried to talk to in this slide was this idea of having a staged access process, which is to say that some people might not be interested in giving interviews, but they might be okay to kind of
be filmed.
Yeah, it's like that. So it's this idea of staging the access process, so the process of gaining access or entry, even entry and then access. So is kind of this process that's not blanket approach. So I'm not going and saying I want all of this. I'm kind of in my ethics process. I'm saying, well, whatever you're comfortable with.
There was it's called geosemiotic research.
Oh yes.
Yeah, used a lot in marketing.
Oh wow.
Because that's capturing stuff in process. So maybe I don't know. It sounds really again too much for this, but there is actually something called geosemiotic research. But I mean,
and if I do trip up, I might. I might be able
but
to
maybe like later on down the track, if this is what you've been doing and are doing, and then we think, oh, it doesn't fit into this, but it is this. Again, you can justify. But for the purposes of getting through this stage, I think probably best to come across as not too ambitious.
I mean, the other thing is, for the panel, is I thought if I am seen as being overly ambitious, when I want your feedback on this, I'm willing to say to the panel, look, yes, I am being ambitious about this PhD, but I'm willing to take advice. I'm willing to, let go of things. And this is why I wanted to bring it to the panel as something.
Do you know who your panel is?
No, I don't.
Do you know?
It's in, I think.
Oh, is it in the email?
Yeah. We've got Bridget, Peter Zamborski, and Joseph.
I know Joseph.
He's the new guy down in Helen's office.
What's that area?
He said hello in the elevator, and I said, "Oh, you're a student of mine." He said, "No, I'm your colleague." It's a bit awkward because he looks young. Because it did remind me of one of my students.
No, I'm a professor of something.
Yeah. So hang on, but he was a new hire, so they were hired in.
Innovation? Well, look it up. Best to look up their profile. You know Bridget well.
Yes.
Peter Zaborski, he was too sure what he does.
It's international business, right?
IB, yeah.
So, yeah, Bridget is. So there's
CEO.
some people who are on panels who are a little bit less kind, let's say, and I don't think you've got those people, which is good. And Bridget is generally she's a helpful personality.
Yeah,
She's
and she'll be fascinated with your methods and methodology.
Yeah. But
she's a lot of discourse analysis.
Yes,
And she's
Yeah.
a methodologist,
She's
right?
a
So
great
she knows her
person.
stuff. And so, but she's a great personality to have on the panel because she's not there to do harm. She's there to help, which isn't always true. So don't. Just be careful. To your point about you're ambitious, but you're open to feedback and you're coachable. That is totally true. But don't say to the panel that you're using them as a test to see whether you're on the right track, because that's meant to be our job. So just be conscious that, and even verbalize this is ambitious, but my plan at the moment is to do this with the different methods.
Well, like you said earlier, it's ambitious, but it makes sense because.
And just to think about, that's going to be so much stuff to analyse. How are you going to pull that off? Perhaps it may be sensible that given this theory, this research question, that these methods are going to give you the most useful data. How useful is a picture really going to be, or how useful is an interview really going to be? Kind of thing. So there's that thread again. So just little practical things. Your the Venn diagram. I was glad to see that because I was writing down that when you were going through, so you're going to sort of reprioritize or sort of say that these are the main things, and other stuff will either say as support theories or support knowledge.
Yeah.
So whatever you do with that
Yeah.
is going to be captured in a visual like this.
Yes.
I would say put that first.
That's exactly what I had.
Yeah. So that when you go through
So
them,
yeah.
we can see the framework that it's
And
going into.
maybe on the slide have a little version of the,
Yeah.
you know, as you go through the points so that people can see, you know, that this is how they fit together.
Yes.
Yeah, so yeah, I would
Okay.
exactly like that.
Yeah, 'cause I feel
Visual
like-
indicator
Yeah,
of how we're
because it's a
moving.
pretty
Yeah.
sophisticated bunch of ideas coming together there, so, you know.
And the sort of going through them independently, I was like, okay, how are these overlapping? And that's how they're overlapping. And so show that, and then go through each of them, and I can see, okay, that's the logic between why he's combining these in this way,
Right. And no, I think that's a great idea. So I will take your advice. I'll make SES and distribute or innovation and SES as the main, and then have the others as kind of supporting, you know.
Well, we'll talk it
Context,
through.
yeah.
We just basically take all the feedback and then think about it and then decide.
And this
We're going
is-
to make a decision now.
Yeah, and this is only,
Sleep on it.
and this is whatever we land,
Yeah.
it's only for now, right?
Yeah.
And the one thing I promise you is that your PhD will end with slightly different research questions. So whatever you have now, doesn't matter what they are, they're going to end up a bit different. The theories you use are going to be slightly different in some ways. So
Yeah.
it's just making sure that we set ourselves up, that we've got a believable,
Yeah, it looks like it's
achievable
fine.
PhD, that you're ready to get started, and then data comes in, things start to change, and the panel is just going to make sure that we are, as an institution, not setting you up to fail. We're going to make sure that you're set up to succeed. So they'll say, okay, where are all the risks? I was like, oh, he's gone too big with the theory, or he's gone with an inappropriate methodology, or over ambitious and that kind of thing. So they're just going to look for red flags.
Yeah.
So we want to just mitigate those red flags. So don't feel like we're paring your PhD back to something that's not interesting to you anymore. We're just saying let's get focused, because once you get in, it's going to explode again.
And remember, you've always got a postdoc.
Yes.
Yeah.
So anything that you can't achieve in your doctorate, postdoc.
So my supervisor always said, yeah, that's a great idea. That's for the book you write after your PhD. And she kept saying that, and now I've forgotten all those things. I thought they were probably brilliant ideas. This is Chris. That's your way of managing. Yeah, great. Put that in your book later.
But you've got so much, and it's looking, you know, like even because he presented in my class, and it was like an
Oh, what
hour.
class?
It was an hour, and he had enough for 2 hours.
Yeah.
So to get from there to this to 15 minutes is pretty amazing. And
Oh,
still,
thank you.
yeah.
Thank you.
How do you feel about your PhD in general now?
It's been a transformative experience for me. Like, I've totally transformed the way that I live, the way that I think, you know, the way that I kind of relate with my own family, with my friends. It's completely transformed.
I hope in a good way, or
In a good way, yeah, in a good
not
way.
too bad.
Yeah.
I mean, I shared with Rachel, I mean, I'm happy for you to have a look at this. This is a brochure that I made 7 years ago when I was doing this grassroots activism stint in India.
7 years ago,
Um,
still.
And, you know, like, it was kind of very, you know, rudimentary, kind of just grassroots, a lot of assumptions, but now I feel like I can bring more people to the table, you know, and I can kind of just, yeah, have more awareness of my own assumptions, and I think that's the greatest thing, is I can, yeah, be more tolerant. And
Yeah, no, this is great. It's a great journey,
Yeah.
and I think so much potential too, so really
Just be
great.
careful if you get transformed too much, you'll end up only being able to be like us. You won't be able to go anywhere else.
You'll be totally unemployable.
You just, by anyone other than university, you have to hang out only with us. Only work only with us.
But that's the thing with consulting as well. It forces you to get out into the real world.
well, yeah, I mean, I definitely want to continue with the activism, you know, after the PhD, you know, definitely.
Well, scholarly activism
Yeah.
is a big part of the whole movement around, you know,
That's right.
transformation, conscientisation.
With
Yeah.
in terms of change,
Hmm.
which is what you're trying to achieve as a human, I think, there's lots of ways to do that. There's on the streets activism. There is entrepreneurship. But there's also, to figure out new ways, we need new knowledge. And that's what you're doing with your PhD. And that's what we try and do as an institution, right? So it's all activism in a sense. We can't just go, let's change things into what, and not have knowledge or evidence for why we should change and what we should change to. So you're right in the heart of it.
Thank you. I really got a lot out of that. Thank you very much.
Oh, that's awesome. Thank you very much, Varun.
So
And
the
thank you for sharing this as well.
yeah.
Oh, yeah.